So it's a pleasure to have Martin Reiser here today. He's World Bank's Senior Representative for European Economic Cooperation, so head of the Paris office. And it's a pleasure to have you here today talking about Reboot development, the economics of a livable planet. And yeah, you have a lot of experience in development, actually, as you have been previously a vice president of the South African, Asian region. You have been head of the country office of China, Mongolia, Korea, Brazil, and so on. So a lot of, many countries. So it's a pleasure to have you here today talking about rebooting development.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this talk. The first thing I should say, as you can see on the slide, if you're very attentive, you will see a number of names. You won't see mine. So the first thing I should say is, if you like the report, then thank Richard and his fantastic team for having produced the report. If you didn't like it, blame me for having not presented it as well as I should. But Richard did a tour of some European countries with the report in January. We had him in Paris. We went to London together. He went to Stockholm and to Berlin, but he didn't manage to come to Vienna. And since I knew I was coming, I suggested that I could present it here. And the reason I thought this would be good to do is that really two main reasons. One is there is I think a question mark in some people's minds as to where is the climate and environment discussion going. And I think this report makes it, sort of puts the frame on why this is important for people who care about development, I think quite nicely. And the second is that it has, and this will be more interesting to people in this audience, it has some really interesting new evidence. So without further ado, let me take you through the next sort of 15, 20 minutes or so. So economic progress measured by any kind of indicator has been tremendous over the last 5-6 decades. If you think about poverty at the beginning of the 1980s, 40% of the world was living in extreme poverty. Today, that number is below 10%. We had infant mortality rates that were easily in the upper tens, in many countries over 100. Now, in many countries, this is below 20. Globally, infant mortality has fallen by 70%. And at that time, in the early 80s, many countries didn't have access to sanitation, did not have access to electricity, and many households did not have access to running water. Today, 70% of households globally have access to electricity and running water. The 30% is still a shockingly large number, and we need to do more about it, but progress has been tremendous. But this has come at a price. And one way for us to think about this, just an illustration, think of all the mammals in the world. Think of all the big animals that you can think of, whales and elephants and giraffes and rhinoceros and hippopotamus, all the things that I loved to see as a kid when I went to the zoo with my grandfather. And now think about how much do they weigh? How much is that biomass compared to all of the humans and all of the domesticated animals that we have? Cows, chicken, pigs. What would be the guess, the relationship between those? I would have guessed 50-50.
Into 93, 7 to 1.
95% to 5. 95% to 5. Okay, 60% of the biomass of the biomass of animals on the planet are domesticated animals. 35% of the biomass are humans, and only 5% are wild mammals. This was not always so. If you'd asked me in 1850, and I would have said 50%, I would have been right. So the shift over the course of development has been dramatic. And that's just one way to express what we know, which is biodiversity loss, the loss of species, which is accelerating at a frightening rate. One well-known concept to express this concern is the concept of the planetary boundaries. This comes from Johan Rockström at the Stockholm, who has sort of established the concept. And we now believe that out of the 9 planetary boundaries, 6, we may have reached the boundaries in 6 of the dimensions. Basically meaning that we have exceeded the safe limits where we have a pretty good scientific evidence that we know that this is sustainable. So we don't know exactly what happens when we breach it, but the risk that something seriously might go wrong increases significantly beyond those safe boundaries. And the reason we care about this in development is that, you know, when I studied development economics, a way to think about the environment and development was that you start being poor, but you have lovely nature. Then over the course of development, you start polluting that nature, but you get rich. And then when you're rich enough, you start cleaning it up. And then eventually you end up being a bit like Switzerland, beautiful nature and very rich, or Austria, I should have said, right? The reality is that this environmental Kuznets curve no longer holds. Because we have breached planetary boundaries, because our ecosystems have become so fragile, you have an increasing number of people who are poor and are affected by environmental risks, not of their own making, but that often reflect the fact that our ecosystems are connected across the planet, and they may find themselves trapped in low income and poor environmental conditions. So if you take just 3 environmental factors, air pollution, land degradation, and water stress, then 79% of people in low-income countries are affected by all 3 of these stresses. In high-income countries, only 1%, virtually nobody in the population is affected by all 3 stresses. And close to half of the population is affected by none of the stresses. So what this means is that you may be poor and trapped in poverty because of environmental conditions. If you manage to develop, though, you may achieve the means to protect yourself from environmental risks. You may be able to afford, interventions that reduce these environmental risks. But it is no longer the case that you start with a clean sheet and can start polluting, because you may already be at a point where further pollution may lead to catastrophe. So this is an important change in the way we think about the relationship between environment and economic development. Now, we can also ask that question the other way around. If this is the case, it may be that we can establish how nature directly contributes to economic development. So if the deterioration of the natural environment, the lack of a livable planet, is a constraint on development, is a constraint on you being able to achieve prosperity, the reverse could also be true, that if you have better environmental conditions, it may actually help you. It may actually help you in an economic sense. And this is where a lot of the novel analytical work of this report comes in. This is where the novel empirical evidence comes in. And I want to illustrate this with respect to land and water linkages. So where does rain come from? Well, most people, myself included before I met Richard, think that rain comes from clouds, and the clouds come from the ocean. Right? So we have oceans, the clouds form over the ocean, and then it rains. Well, that's only half of the story. Half of the rain in the world doesn't come from the oceans. It comes from the forests. It comes through what we call transevaporation. Massive clouds form over the Amazon forest. The winds carry these clouds all across the land in Latin America and influence the rain thousands of miles away in the southern cone. And this effect was first found by Brazilian scientists several decades ago, but it was a hypothesis. We now have much better data on exactly how deforestation affects rainfall loss. And this is a chart that shows you this for South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and you can see how rainfall in the middle of South America is dramatically affected by the loss of forestation in the Amazon, right? And you can see the same thing happening in the Congo Basin. You can see the same thing happening in Sumatra and Borneo.
Sorry, just one question. Yes, for these graphs. So is it the rainfall loss due to deforestation? What is there on scale? So,
Yes.
Yes. It's similar.
So it's the average drop in rainfall, right, in percentage terms, with the darker colors basically meaning more rainfall loss as a result of deforestation. So it's a causal link that we can use modeling analysis now to attribute the amount of rainfall loss specifically to the loss of forests. Okay, so we can spatially map this. This is work that I think has been done in collaboration with the Potsdam Institute and their climate models. Okay, now what we can do as economists is translate rainfall loss into GDP, because the economies in these countries basically rely on rainfall. They don't have irrigation. They rely on agriculture. Think of Brazil and the importance of the agricultural sector to Brazil's exports, for example. And we can translate rainfall loss into losses in agricultural yield and losses in agricultural yield into losses in GDP. There's some other factors that the model also considers. And basically the result of this econometric analysis shows that just taking into account the direct link between deforestation and rainfall and growth, you see across Latin America losses in GDP of between 1/10 and 8/10 of a percentage point, annual GDP losses. But this is not where it stops. Think about where the rain goes, right? Once it rains, we think that most of the rain then basically seeps into rivers and returns to the ocean, and then it creates another cycle of rain. Well, that would be only 1/3 of the hydrological cycle. 65% of the rain that falls goes into increasing soil moisture, and soil moisture is a critical determinant of the link between rainfall and agricultural productivity. So once you take into account the role that forests play as sponges, we can incorporate that into our economic analysis of the impact of rainfall loss. And when you think about forests, the impact on soil moisture, the impact on yields, and the impact on GDP growth, the effects become larger still. So for Latin America now, the average, which before was around 0.25% of GDP, the average now is 0.75% of GDP, so almost 3 times as large once you take into account the role that forests play as sponges in maintaining humidity and then passing it on to the soil. And the effects are large in most other regions except for the Middle East because they have hardly any forests. Not all forests are identical. So this effect that I just described is the impact that forests play, or the role that forests play as sponges, is much higher for natural forests than for plantation forests. So it's not enough once you've deforested to say, well, we're going to plant lots of eucalyptus or lots of fast-growing conifers or whatever, because the capacity of the forest to retain moisture and to contribute to land productivity is much higher for natural forests than for plantation forests, which is why we need to care from an economic point of view about conservation. It's not just about reforestation. So if we know that some people are poor and trapped by their environmental conditions and find it hard to escape poverty, and we also know that a better natural environment can make a positive contribution to economic growth, can we actually find a model of economic growth that doesn't go on the upward path of the Kuznets curve, right? Can we find economic growth that basically does not increase the environmental footprint? That is key. If we can find that, then we have a solution to the problems, or we can find a way to reboot development. If we can't find that, then we have some real trade-offs that we need to think hard about. Okay, and so a good part of the report then goes into an analysis of what these trade-offs may look like. So scale, more production will require more natural resources, but we may produce other things. We may move from consuming meat to consuming plant-based proteins, for example, with a much lower footprint on water, with a much lower footprint on methane emissions, etc. Right? We may build houses with wood rather than with concrete and steel, and that again will have composition effects, delivering the same bundle of goods and of services, but with a slightly different composition. And then finally, we may vastly increase efficiency in the way we produce, agricultural yields being the obvious example. So we can do this decomposition across four causes of pollution: air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, land degradation, and water loss and water stress. What this chart basically summarizes is the decomposition analysis of the report. And you can see that scale effects would so the way to read this chart is the full length of the chart gives you the impact of scale, and then you move in the opposite direction as a result of composition and efficiency. Okay, so, and then the net changes are the orange part on the graph. There's an animated version of this presentation where this is easier to explain. But basically, efficiency makes the largest contribution to reducing the environmental footprint of economic growth. Composition makes a positive contribution for the case of air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and water loss. But composition has so far, we have not found a way to consume goods, different sets of goods and services that reduce the impact that higher incomes have on land degradation. Yes?
It's supposed to be on a worldwide scale, or is this?
This is a global, yes, these are global, basically global calculations. Okay. So the net changes are still positive. We haven't fully decoupled, but we have, relatively speaking, decoupled. Okay. Now, when you think about efficiency, there are many low-hanging fruit. I'll give you three examples of this. The first is nitrogen fertilizer use. The invention of nitrogen fertilizers revolutionized agriculture, led to significant increases in yields, and most agricultural systems around the world are heavily dependent on nitrogen fertilizer use. But a large number of countries, in fact, 50% of global food is grown in areas where the use of nitrogen fertilizer exceeds the optimum, where we use more nitrogen fertilizer than we would need to maximize yields. And that is because in many countries, governments subsidize the use of nitrogen fertilizer. And so farmers don't know what the real price of the fertilizer is, and they just apply as much as possible. The marginal productivity increase from applying more fertilizer in many of these countries is lower than the real cost of fertilizer production, but because the fertilizer is subsidized, the farmers still apply it. So this is an obvious case where efficiency gains could be achieved for the benefit of water resources, less water pollution, for the benefit of land health, less land degradation, for the benefit of air pollution in many cases, and greenhouse gas emissions, given the energy use in the production of nitrogen fertilizer. And yet we don't do it because the price signals are wrong. Air pollution. So I was, as you mentioned, country director in China, and I was living in China at a time when China made tremendous progress in the reduction of air pollution. 15 years ago, the air in Beijing at this time of year was so foul that you would hardly dare to go outside the door. Today, the number of days you have in Beijing that look like this outside of Vienna has increased dramatically. I was in Beijing when Chinese friends told me for the first time in their living memory, they were able to go to the Great Wall of China and see the towers of the skyline of Beijing. That had never happened in their lifetimes. But unfortunately, this tremendous success has not been replicated everywhere. So once you take China out of the equation, global air pollution is still increasing. But China clearly shows that it's possible to have rapid economic growth, because during that period between 2012, 2020, China grew at an average rate close to 6% annually, and yet air pollution declined. So this is absolute decoupling.
And do you know what China, was it the composition effect? Was it the
well, yes, a number of things. Some of it was composition. So as China's incomes grew, the elasticity of demand for services, as we know, the income elasticity of demand for services tends to be higher than the income elasticity of demand for manufacturing. And so as incomes grew, the composition of China's economy shifted towards services emit less air pollution. So that's the composition effect. There was an efficiency effect. The Chinese invested heavily in end-of-pipe equipment, into low emission power stations, into better technology that allowed them to reduce air pollution. Some of it was also urban planning. So air pollution tends to get concentrated. If you think of a valley where the smog cannot escape, they relocated some of the most polluting plants into areas where there were better wind channels. So some pollution still occurs, but it's no longer as concentrated. I think that's also reflected in some of the measurement that we have here, which comes from the big cities in China. But I think the bulk of it is efficiency. Some of it is composition. The bulk of it is efficiency. It's just better equipment. There was one more slide here on low-hanging fruit for improving efficiency. If you count the implicit and explicit subsidies that basically push the world towards more polluting activities, as a result of government handing out money, we count that a total of $7 trillion annually are spent on environmentally harmful subsidies. If you just got rid of those subsidies, you would have a massive effect on relative prices, and as a result, a massive incentive to improve efficiency and a massive impact on composition. And so you would have gains in economic efficiency because subsidies tend to be distortive. So very unlikely risks to economic growth and significant environmental benefits as a result. And then finally, before I close, we also wanted, because the World Bank has put jobs very much at the center of our development agenda, we wanted to find out, if you move towards a less polluting economic model, would this be good or bad for jobs? This result is not based on empirical analysis. This result is based on general equilibrium analysis. And the result is not different than what many other studies found, that basically the green sectors create more jobs than the polluting sectors on average. Okay, so $1 million invested in less polluting sectors creates 14 male jobs and 9 female jobs. The same amount of money invested in more polluting sectors creates 6 male jobs and 3 female jobs. So the impact on jobs of moving towards a more, less heavy environmentally damaging economic model tend to be positive as well. So finally, what are some of the high-level principles that come out of this recognition of the links between environment and development, the way that development is really embedded in nature? First, we need even more information. This new analysis on the link between rainfall and deforestation, I think, offers a lot of additional reasons for why you would want to protect and conserve the forests, far above, with an economic benefit, far above any of the benefit the forests provide to us in terms of capturing GHG emissions. Right? There are local benefits from forests that countries are often ignoring, and that could have very significant GDP effects, and that may change the calculation on deforestation in places like the Amazon, for example. We need, I think, more and a better understanding of the risks of breaching the environmental limits, and the way that different environmental systems, like I showed you for forests, rainfall, and land degradation, are interconnected. So just looking at one natural resource is often insufficient. There's a lot more in the report. I hope I did it reasonable justice. There are chapters on cities and on commerce, for example. One of the findings, since Gabriel is here and has done a lot of work on trade in his career, one of the findings is that trade contributes to reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. It also contributes to reducing water stress. Because water-rich countries trade water incentive good with water-scarce countries. And so there are efficiency gains. We don't see the same effects on land degradation and on air pollution. It appears that, for example, trade leads to the concentration of industrial activity in areas with heavy air pollution, and trade doesn't improve that outcome. So just as a finding, and then there are a lot of other detailed chapters that I didn't cover, like biodiversity and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. So let's start the discussion. Online, please just raise your hand, and else just let's start the discussion here.
Please.
If you had the discussion about the reduction of GHG emissions, you always, I feel that there is a kind of divide between developing countries and developed countries. And I have the feeling that developing countries do not have the same value on the environmental aspect as we do in Europe, or especially in Europe, I would say. So if there is knowledge coming from, say, Brazil about this water circulation, do you think that might change this attitude that they still have? So we somehow exploited them 100 years ago. So developed countries do have to carry the burden of the adjustment, rather than developing countries? Do you think there is some shift going on in the perception? If new results are coming from developing countries rather than developed countries?
So I think yes, in the specific case of Brazil and deforestation. Generally speaking, I would say no, and I think for good reason. I mean, you know, on a per capita basis, Europe still produces vastly more GHG emissions than India, vastly more. And Europe is much, much richer than India. So if you go to the Indians and say, oh, yes, but, you know, in the future, you know, you account because you're so many Indians and we're so few Europeans, you know, you're going to have to make a bigger contribution to solving this problem. I mean, you know, you can forgive the Indians for saying, yeah, but why are you turning to me? You created the problem in the first place. On a per capita basis, my emissions are still, you know, at a level that you had in the early 20th century, or actually late 19th century. Why are you turning to me? Now, in reality, I think technologies are so. Let me say the reason it's true for Brazil is because the environmental damage is local, right? The deforestation leads to rainfall loss that affects Brazilian agriculture. So they have a natural interest. And part of the purpose of this work is to demonstrate these linkages. So, you know, when we talk about planetary boundaries, we're not talking about rich people worried, you know, about the future of the planet and poor people saying, hang on a minute, I've got other problems. Right? We're showing that these linkages affect poor people more than rich people and affect the prospects for development. And therefore, this is a development issue. The greenhouse gas emissions are a classic global public good, or public bad. And so you have the classic collective action problems that you have with any public goods. And those haven't really gone away. And this analysis, I don't think, is going to shift that. What's going to shift that, I think, is technology. I think what we now see is that, you know, for example, renewable energy is by far the cheaper technology for the bulk of countries. What I worry about, frankly, in Europe is that in the context of increasing gas prices, increasing energy prices, and a revival of interest in industrial policy, the European debate seems to be going in the direction of subsidizing energy to maintain energy-intensive industries in Europe, when Europe clearly does not have a comparative advantage in energy-intensive industries, right? It neither has the sunshine that, you know, more southern countries have, nor does it have the massive hydro power. It could, you know, expand atomic energy, but everything points to the potential benefits of Europe trading with other countries in energy-intensive products and focusing on less energy-intensive, higher value-added products and industry in Europe. The debate over industrial policy in Europe, to me, at the moment, seems to suggest we want to keep the polluting stuff here. And then if we do that, and on top go and tell the Indians that they should do more to save the global climate, I do think we have a credibility problem. I don't think that's going to go very well.
Thanks for that fascinating discussion or presentation. I have first a question about, piggybacking on what Thomas just asked, about regional developmental dynamics, political dynamics. Thinking of the map that you showed for South America, the drop in rainfall. So using that map, the drop in rainfall due to the deforestation was not only confined to Brazil,
Yes,
but it also affected the region. What do your counterparts of the World Bank in, say, Bolivia, Paraguay, or those countries say about the map when you show that very drop in rainfall map to them? That's my first question. Second question is, I would like to learn more about the modeling that you've done. I don't know if you can tell from the top of your head, yeah, but the modeling details about the water use. You were focusing on agriculture. That makes complete sense, especially in a development context. But I was wondering about the databases that you've used and whether you have information about water use that stretches beyond agriculture. The reason I'm asking this is we have just completed a first study on the wider use of water as a critical resource. We've done this as a case study for Austria. We're currently upscaling this to the European Union. Going forward, we expect that water will be a critical resource and also affecting industry, and this will have wider effects. So that's the underlying thing, and that would be a natural extension if you have such data, and would be also a possible collaboration. Thank you.
So on these regional effects, which were, I think, on this chart here, I can't tell you. My time in Latin America is 10 years ago, so I haven't spoken to the Paraguayans and the Bolivians about this. I would note that Bolivia has some piece of rainforest, and so the discussion about forest conservation does include Bolivia. But it's clear that Paraguay, which doesn't have a lot of forest, suffers a lot from the falling clouds. Actually, within Brazil, this is also a massive distributional issue because the richer parts of Brazil, the São Paulo, the south, to some extent also the rich agricultural provinces in the west, are very much affected, whereas the deforestation happens in the poor provinces in the north, right? So there are these distributional issues. I don't know how the political economy of this goes. I do know there have been attempts to create an Amazon-wide, multi-country framework for forest conservation, or at least for monitoring of deforestation. So there is consciousness that this is not just a national problem, but how exactly this plays out in the political economy, I can't tell you. On the modeling, I do think, but I will check with Richard's team. I do think, or modeling. This is based on econometric analysis, and I think it includes a number of. It includes multiple water uses, not just agriculture. Otherwise, these effects would be too large. I mean, getting a percentage point of GDP on a sector that only represents, even in Latin America, at most 20% of GDP, probably more like 15, would be a very significant effect. I suspect that this includes other water uses, but I will check. I will have to check.
And I have a question, as we are talking about deforestation, and kind of the question came up prior already, what kind of we can also do about it. And there are a lot of initiatives also within the EU, for example, that we have a lot of the non-trade objectives and nowadays in the trade agreements. We have the deforestation initiatives. Do you think this has any impact, for example, on the deforestation itself?
I mean, I think, for example, the Mercosur agreement, right, which included some provisions, I think is helpful, right, because it helps strengthen those in the countries concerned that themselves want to strengthen environmental protection, and as a result get support through these trade agreements for their domestic argument. Now, if you try and do this pretty much against the resistance of everybody concerned, I don't know whether the EU ever had or would have that leverage. And what we find with this value chain requirement, the Lieferkettengesetz in German, this is highly unpopular even among German or among European industry, because the bureaucratic effort concerned to measure all these Scope 2 and Scope 3 effects and declare them properly is probably in excess of the environmental benefits that would result from it. But I do think the European Union has, standard setting power. And so whether it's CBAM or whether it's the Mercosur agreement or whether it's other food safety and other kinds of requirements, the EU can, through its trade and single market policies to some extent signal and create at least incentives for other countries to change their environmental policies. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that is happening. There's a recent discussion around CBAM, for example, when you look at the number of developing countries that have recently introduced carbon trading rules within their own economies. Think of Turkey, for example. A lot of that is motivated by their desire to still access the European market, and with CBAM, that gives them an advantage. So.
Thank you very much for the really interesting talk, and I'm really no expert in this kind of field. To be honest, I'm still thinking about your statement at the very beginning of your talk about, and I'm shocked about the mass of human beings compared to wild animals or to the biomass of wild animals. So, and although you presented also some positive figures, thinking about the pollution, rated air pollution decreasing at least when including China, or stagnating when excluding China worldwide. I'm still thinking, well, how is it with the non-population rated air pollution? So given this figure and given the mass of human beings worldwide, given that the demographic forecasts shifted the peak of the worldwide population years and years upward because developing countries didn't behave like researchers in these fields figured out they would behave in the future in terms of birth rates and so on. I'm really thinking, so why, you mentioned a lot of policy instruments like technological change, efficiency gains due to technology, and of course also the composition effect of economies. But I'm wondering, at least from my point of view, why policy instruments shifted from what was suggested by the Club of Rome in the 70s about incentivizing human beings to reduce birth rates worldwide. But at least from my point of view, I think that those ideas just disappeared and are not very popular at the moment. So I'm wondering if this wasn't one of the huge problems we should solve, actually, that there are just too many human beings living on this world.
I'm not sure I would agree with you. I mean, first of all, I think the evidence is that, even though I think in broad sense, the Club of Rome's report didn't have a huge impact on economic policy, and not because of the Club of Rome, but fertility rates have declined dramatically since the 1970s, everywhere, right? I mean, and in fact, if you look 10 years back or 15 years back, the projections on where the world population would end were much higher than they are today. So, the growing number of people who worry about, humans going out of business. I mean, essentially, people no longer having children. And so what looks like a very exponential increase can also become a relatively rapid decline once people, the average family only has one child. In Korea, it's 0.7, right? That the exponential law applies on the way down. So I'm not sure I share the concern about excess population. And in any case, the humans that were born over the last 50 years are already here. And we need to figure out a way to construct a livable planet for them and for their children. So I'm not sure I would look at birth control as the main policy to deal with these issues. But I do think what this graph illustrates and some of the other analysis illustrates is that we do need to understand that the economy is embedded in the natural environment. I mean, the laws of nature still apply. You can substitute the use of resources, but that will require the use of another resource. You can take energy from the sky, from the sun, but you will need raw materials to produce the wafers that generate the energy. So we need to be conscious of the fact that we don't operate in isolation from natural systems, and that when they break down, this can be very costly especially for poor people, right? But at the same time, I think the evidence does suggest that there are ways to generate economic prosperity, to generate economic growth that don't have a deleterious environmental footprint. And the evidence also strongly suggests that the richer we are, the better we're able to build systems the better we are able to build resilient systems, the better we're able to make ourselves resilient against the effects of a changing climate, for example. So I don't think the solution, this is a very long-winded answer to say, I don't think the solution is birth control, and I don't think the solution is no growth. I think neither of those solutions are, in my view, normatively desirable. There are far too many poor people, and telling people how many children to have, I don't think is a good idea. And they're not going to provide a solution, because growth is essential to the solution of some of the problems that I mentioned. But growth without consideration of its environmental effects could lead us into the wrong direction. And I think there is a way to have growth conscious of environmental effects and produce what we call in our mission shared prosperity on a livable planet. And we have to have the livable planet as part of that. Shared prosperity without a livable planet is unlikely to be prosperity. So sort of a more normative statement, but I think the analysis of the report bears it out.
From your presentation, I conclude that it's critical to avoid developing countries to move steeply upwards the Kuznets curve, the environmental Kuznets curve. And I think new technology may make that happen, or may alleviate that problem. But I was thinking that we have this kind of compensation payments within Europe. If you don't achieve your GHG values within your country, you can make compensating investments in developing countries. And I would be interested in whether you can see some potential in expanding this type of compensatory payments rather than investing hardly in Europe, where we have rather high technology available. Because within Europe, I think this instrument is very critically viewed, especially from Greens. But if I think about that and your presentation, I see some potential.
I would agree with you. I mean, I think the general class of instruments that you refer to is probably what we would call payment for ecosystem services. And whether you make those payments because national regulation requires you to do it, whether you make those payments because you are motivated, you have an environmental objective in your utility function, and you like to pay for improved environments. But when you think about mobilizing financing for the kinds of investments in better solutions that are less environmentally damaging and produce better economic outcomes, that will require some level of investment. Well, where's that investment going to come from? When the environment doesn't cost anything, it's very hard to mobilize investments into that direction, right? Because the other direction may be just as cheap, maybe even cheaper, and the environment doesn't cost you anything. So we need to think about ways in which we can compensate for the economic externality that the environment creates, and the payment for ecosystem services is one way to do that. It's much easier to organize this when you have an upstream polluter and a downstream user, and the downstream user compensates the upstream polluter for not polluting because they get the benefits directly. It's more difficult when you do that at a global level, where we are, in some sense, the downstream users, but are not directly affected by the pollution that may be happening elsewhere. We may still want to pay. So. Again, long-winded way to say, I think the incorporation of that 5% as part of the EU climate plan, if well designed, can make a significant contribution to lowering the costs of emission reduction for European industry, but also to provide significant financial transfers to incentivize developing countries to do the same. But you could apply similar mechanisms in other areas. And we are trying in our line of work, which is mostly financing rather than research in the World Bank, we try to develop those kinds of financing structures. And we've done a number of them, from rhino bonds to sustainability bonds to carbon markets to a range of other solutions. But so far, what we are able to mobilize on a global scale is well short of what would be required. And so we still need more ideas on how to do this.
Any further questions here or online? Don't see any questions online. Any further questions here?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk and very interesting discussion. So thank you very much.